Hey everyone. Tonight, we begin not with speculation, not with theories borrowed from television or best-selling paperbacks, but with the oldest written memories humanity ever left behind. Long before pyramids pierced the Egyptian skyline, long before the Sphinx watched over the desert, long before civilization looked anything like what we imagine today, human hands pressed meaning into wet clay. These tablets are not legends told centuries later. They are the first deliberate attempt to explain existence itself, where the world came from, how order emerged, and why humans believed they had a place within it. Before we go any further, settle in, lower the lights, let the world outside quiet down. What we're about to explore belongs to a time when memory was fragile, when writing itself was an experiment, and when explaining reality meant turning to the most fundamental forces people knew. Tonight, we are listening to the Sumerian texts speak in their own voice, without modern filters, without sensational overlays, and without forcing them to confirm ideas they were never meant to support. This journey begins before the Anunnaki became a buzzword, before ancient astronaut theories reshaped public imagination, before modern interpreters claimed that gods descended from the sky in machines of fire and metal. The clay tablets do not start there. They start somewhere quieter, older, and far more elemental. According to the earliest Sumerian traditions, existence did not begin with gods walking on solid ground or issuing commands from the heavens. It began with water. Not water as we experience it today, rivers, rain, or seas, but water as pure potential. The Sumerians called this primal reality Nammu. She was not a goddess in the later, human-like sense. She had no throne, no myths of jealousy or war. Nammu was the cosmic sea itself, the undivided source from which everything else would emerge. To understand why water held this role, we need to step into the lived reality of southern Mesopotamia. The Sumerians settled between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in a flat alluvial plain where survival depended entirely on water. When floods came at the right time, life flourished. When they came too early, too late, or too violently, cities starved or vanished beneath the currents. Water was not a symbol to them. It was life, death, and renewal all at once. So when they imagined the beginning of everything, they imagined endless waters before form, before direction, before time itself had rules. Nammu was that condition, a state where nothing had yet separated, where possibility existed without shape, a universe not yet organized, waiting. From this primordial sea, the texts tell us, emerged the first distinction. Nammu gave rise to An, the sky, and Ki, the earth. These were not gods walking among humans. They were cosmic principles. Heaven above, earth below. At first, they were joined together, locked in a single mass with no space between them. There was no air, no atmosphere, no place for life to move or breathe. Everything existed, but nothing could unfold. Creation, in the Sumerian understanding, required separation, and separation was not gentle. From the union of sky and earth came Enlil, the force of wind and air. His defining act was violent but necessary. He forced heaven upward, tearing it away from earth, creating the space between them. That space, the air, became the realm where clouds form, storms rage, and breath sustains life. Only after this rupture could the ordered world begin. This moment marks the true beginning of the cosmos as the Sumerians understood it. Not creation from nothing, but structure imposed upon chaos. Not a peaceful unfolding, but a decisive break that allowed reality to function. With heaven above, earth below, and air between them, the framework of existence was set. It was simple, but complete. The sky governed time through the movements of sun, moon, and stars. The earth supported cities, fields, and human labor. The air carried storms, rain, and breath itself. This three-layered universe became the foundation of Sumerian thought. Yet, even this was not the earliest memory preserved in the tablets. Beneath the earth, below fields and foundations, the Sumerians believed the primordial waters still existed. The Abzu, an endless subterranean ocean from which springs rose and rivers were fed. This was not myth detached from observation. The land itself confirmed it. Dig deep enough anywhere in Mesopotamia, and water appears. From this simple fact, a cosmic truth emerged. The world rested upon water, surrounded by it, threatened by it, sustained by it. The god most closely associated with this deep was Enki, lord of wisdom and fresh water. Unlike Enlil, whose power expressed itself through authority and force, Enki's strength lay in cleverness, foresight, and adaptation. He dwelled not in the distant heavens but in the depths below, in a palace imagined beneath the earth, at the source of life-giving waters. The city of Eridu, considered by the Sumerians to be the oldest city in the world, was sacred to Enki. His temple there, the Abzu, was believed to stand directly above the point where the cosmic waters touched the human world. To worship there was to stand at the axis of creation itself, where order met chaos, where the divine touched the mortal. These beliefs did not emerge from idle fantasy. They were attempts to make sense of a world shaped by floods, fertility, and fragile order. Long before the Anunnaki were named as judges or powers of fate, the Sumerians were already asking deeper questions. What came before structure? How did order arise? Why is creation always accompanied by destruction? The earliest texts offer no machines from the sky, no distant planets, no visitors from beyond the stars. They offer something older and perhaps more unsettling. The idea that existence itself emerged from instability, that order is maintained only through constant balance, and that beneath the surface of civilization, chaos always waits. And this is where our journey truly begins. When the Sumerian scribes looked back toward the beginning, they did not imagine a clean line separating myth from reality. What they described instead was a gradual settling of existence, as if the universe itself needed time to learn how to hold its shape. After the separation of heaven and earth, after air had been forced into being, the world was still unfinished. Structure existed, but it was fragile. Order had been imposed, but it required constant attention to remain intact. In this early phase, the texts speak of a reality that was still unstable, where boundaries were not yet firm. Water, once undivided, began to differentiate. Fresh water and salt water were no longer the same substance. The rivers that nourished the land were distinct from the seas that surrounded it. This division would later be personified in Babylonian tradition as Apsu and Tiamat, but the older Sumerian memory preserved something simpler. Before those names, before those conflicts, there was only the awareness that water itself had many faces, some life-giving, some destructive. This distinction mattered deeply to the people who recorded it. Fresh water sustained crops and cities. Salt water marked danger, distance, and the unknown. By separating them in myth, the Sumerians were describing the moment when survival became possible, when land could exist without being swallowed by the endless sea. As the cosmos stabilized, divine beings multiplied. But these were not yet the gods of epic drama and rivalry. They were forces given identity. The moon that measured time, the sun that revealed truth, the stars that marked seasons and fate. Each emerged as a response to a need in the newly ordered world. Time had to be tracked, light had to be understood, cycles had to be named. Among these early gods, Enki remained central. While Enlil ruled the air and enforced separation, Enki governed flow. He understood how boundaries could be crossed without collapsing. Where Enlil's power was vertical and absolute, Enki's was lateral and adaptive. He solved problems rather than commanding them away. This distinction would become crucial when the gods themselves encountered a dilemma. The texts describe a time when the divine order, though established, required labor to maintain. Canals had to be dug, silt had to be piled, foundations had to be laid. The world, once separated and structured, did not run on its own. It demanded work, and that work fell upon the lesser gods, divine beings whose role was not to rule, but to labor. They grew exhausted. The tablets preserve their complaints with surprising clarity. They wept. They rebelled. They threatened to abandon their duties, knowing full well that without their labor, order itself would unravel. This moment is critical because it reveals something often ignored in later interpretations. Creation, in Sumerian thought, was not a flawless act performed once and completed forever. It was ongoing, imperfect, and costly. Faced with this crisis, Enki did not respond with punishment. He listened. And once again, it was Nammu, the primordial source, who intervened. She gathered the tears of the suffering gods and brought them to her son in the depths of the Abzu. She did not command him, she reminded him. Creation was at risk. Enki's solution was radical, but not technological. He did not design machines. He did not alter the cosmos itself. He proposed creating helpers, beings who could take on the burden of labor and preserve order without divine exhaustion. Not replacements for the gods, but intermediaries between earth and divinity. Humanity was not created as an afterthought, nor was it created as an act of domination. According to the earliest version of the story, humans were shaped from clay taken from the edge of the Abzu itself, mixed with the essence of the primordial waters. This detail matters. Humans were not formed from corrupted matter or from the remains of defeated beings. They were fashioned from the same substance that existed before creation, infused with a trace of divine vitality. This origin placed humans in a unique position. They belonged fully to neither realm. They were not gods, but they were not merely animals either. They carried within them the memory of chaos and the imprint of order. They were capable of labor, yes, but also of ritual, language, and memory. The birth goddesses shaped these first humans carefully, and the texts do not pretend this process was perfect. Some humans were formed with limitations. Some could not see. Some could not walk. Some could not perform the labor for which they had been intended. Instead of erasing these creations, Enki assigned them roles that allowed them to belong. Even in the earliest myths, there is an awareness that difference did not equal failure. This is not the story of engineered servants. It is the story of adaptation, of problem solving, of a cosmos learning how to sustain itself without collapsing under its own weight. Only after humans took on the work of maintaining canals, fields, and temples did the divine hierarchy stabilize. The gods were freed from labor, order held, civilization became possible. And it is here, much later than popular imagination suggests, that the Anunnaki begin to appear. They do not emerge as creators. They do not descend from the sky. They are not architects of humanity. They enter the narrative as members of an already established divine order, born into a system that existed long before their names were spoken. Their role was not to shape the world, but to judge it. Understanding this sequence changes everything. Before the Anunnaki, there was water. Before them, there was separation. Before them, there was labor, rebellion, and compromise. The cosmos did not begin with rulers issuing commands from the heavens. It began with imbalance, struggle, and the search for sustainability. And in that search, humanity was born. As the world settled into its new rhythm, a deeper structure began to take shape beneath the visible order of sky, earth, and air. The Sumerian texts suggest that once humanity assumed the burden of labor, existence entered a phase that was neither purely divine nor fully human. It was an in-between age, a period when boundaries were still permeable, and the distance between gods and mortals had not yet hardened into permanence. This was the age the tablets remember as the time before the flood. According to the Sumerian king list, kingship itself did not originate from human ambition or social agreement. It descended from heaven. Authority was understood as a divine institution, a pattern imposed upon the human world to mirror the order of the cosmos. The first rulers were not ordinary men. They belonged to a different category of being, figures whose lives stretched across spans of time that defy modern comprehension. The list opens with a striking declaration. After kingship descended from heaven, it was in Eridu, the first city, the city of Enki, the place where the cosmic waters touch the surface world. From there, rule passed through a sequence of sacred cities, each associated with specific aspects of civilization. Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sipar, Shurupak. 5 cities, each representing a stage in the unfolding of human order. The kings who ruled in this era reigned not for decades, but for tens of thousands of years. Alulim, Alalangar, Enmenluana. Their reigns, recorded in precise numerical systems, totaled over 200,000 years. These numbers were not meant to be read as ordinary chronology. They marked mythic time, a mode of existence fundamentally different from the historical era that followed. In this early world, time itself behaved differently. Life extended far beyond natural limits. The boundary between divine and mortal was thin enough to cross. Kings were not merely rulers, they were custodians of cosmic order, intermediaries between heaven and earth. Their authority did not rest on conquest or inheritance, but on proximity to the divine. The cities they governed were not random settlements. Each carried symbolic weight. Eridu stood for origin, the birthplace of civilization. Bad Tibira was associated with metallurgy, the transformation of raw material into tools and wealth. Sipar belonged to the sun god, the center of justice, law, and illumination. Shurupak, the final city, marked the threshold of catastrophe. This age was not remembered as chaotic. On the contrary, it was seen as a time of closeness. Gods moved more freely among humans. Knowledge flowed directly from the divine realm. Civilization emerged not through slow experimentation, but through gifts. Agriculture, animal husbandry, writing, kingship. Each was understood as something received, not invented. But this intimacy carried risk. As humanity prospered, cities expanded, fields spread, canals multiplied. The very success of civilization produced an unintended consequence: noise. The texts are unambiguous about this detail. Human activity grew so loud that it disturbed the gods themselves. The ceaseless sound of labor, trade, celebration, and daily life rose into the heavens, breaking the stillness the gods required. This was not a moral failure. Humans were not condemned for sin or corruption. They were condemned for being too numerous, too active, too present. Civilization had become disruptive. Among the gods, Enlil found this unbearable. As lord of air and authority, he was responsible for maintaining order, and in his view, order required silence. Humanity, in its success, had tipped the balance. The solution he proposed was final: a flood, not as punishment for wrongdoing, but as a reset, a return to quiet, a cleansing of excess. The divine assembly agreed. The decision was made. Humanity would be erased, and the world would be restored to stillness. But the cosmos was not governed by a single will. Enki, who had helped create humanity in the first place, could not accept total annihilation. Humans were flawed, yes, but they served a purpose. They maintained the world. They upheld temples. They preserved order. Destroying them entirely would undo the solution that had stabilized existence. Bound by divine law, Enki could not openly oppose the decree, but he could circumvent it. The texts describe his intervention with careful subtlety. He did not warn humanity directly. He spoke to walls. He whispered through dreams. He delivered knowledge without technically violating the command that no god should reveal the coming catastrophe. The recipient of this warning was Ziusudra, king of Shurupak, the last ruler of the antediluvian world. Enki instructed him to build a vessel, not a symbol, not a metaphor, a physical structure capable of preserving life through the coming destruction. The flood that followed was absolute within the Sumerian world. Cities vanished. Fields disappeared. The ordered landscape returned to water. For 7 days and nights, chaos reclaimed what had been separated at the beginning of time. When the waters receded, only the vessel remained. Ziusudra survived. Life endured, and with survival came transformation. The old age had ended. The new world would not operate under the same conditions. The gods recognized this. Humanity was allowed to continue, but limits were imposed. Lifespans shortened. Mortality became fixed. The closeness between gods and humans was reduced. The era of myth gave way, slowly, to the era of history. Ziusudra himself was removed from the human world, granted eternal life in Dilmun, a liminal land beyond ordinary geography, a place untouched by decay, a memory of what had been lost. And it is only after this transition, after the flood had redrawn the boundaries of existence, that the Anunnaki assume their defined role. Not as creators, not as visitors, but as judges. They belonged to the new order, guardians of fate, enforcers of boundaries that could no longer be crossed. Their authority lay not in the sky, but beneath the earth, in the realm all mortals would eventually enter. The world had changed, and with it, humanity's place within the cosmos. With the flood behind them, the world the Sumerians imagined was no longer fluid and intimate. It had become regulated. Boundaries that were once permeable hardened into laws. The distance between gods and humans, once narrow enough to cross through ritual and dream, widened into something far more absolute. This shift marked the true beginning of the age the Sumerians themselves would have recognized as their own. After the waters receded, kingship descended from heaven once more. But this time, it did not return unchanged. The Sumerian king list is careful in how it frames this moment. Authority reappears in the city of Kish, not Eridu. The sacred center of origins gave way to a new political reality. Power moved north. History replaced myth. The reigns of kings grew shorter, still long by modern standards, but no longer impossibly vast. Hundreds of years became the measure, then decades. The text itself seems to acknowledge this transition, gradually shifting from mythic time into something closer to lived memory. This was not accidental. It reflected a belief that the world itself now operated under different rules. Mortality was no longer negotiable. The divine-human boundary had been sealed. It is within this new cosmic order that the Anunnaki appear most clearly. Their role becomes consistent across multiple texts. They are no longer vague ancestral figures or part of a distant genealogy. They are officials, judges, determiners of fate. Their authority does not concern creation, agriculture, or the founding of cities. Those tasks belong to earlier gods like Enki, Enlil, and the birth goddesses. The Anunnaki govern something else entirely. They preside over the realm beneath the earth. The Sumerians imagined the universe as layered, not only above but below. Beneath fields and foundations lay Kur, the land of the dead, a place without light, without growth, without return. Every human, regardless of status or virtue, would eventually pass into this realm. Death was not moral judgment, it was destination. The Anunnaki ruled here. They were known as the Seven who decree. They sat in assembly. They fixed destinies. They did not argue. Their decisions were final. Even the gods themselves were subject to their authority when crossing into this domain. This role is illustrated most clearly in the story of Inanna's descent. When the great goddess chose to enter the underworld, she did not do so as a conqueror. She was stripped of her power at each gate, her crown, her jewelry, her symbols of authority. By the time she reached the throne of Ereshkigal, she stood naked and defenseless. The Anunnaki pronounced judgment. They fastened the eyes of death upon her, and she was killed, hung on a hook like any other being who entered that realm. This moment reveals the true nature of their power. They did not rule through force or technology. They ruled through inevitability, through law that no one, divine or mortal, could escape. Only Enki's intervention restored Inanna to life, and even then it required substitution. A life for a life. The balance could not be broken. It could only be rearranged. This is not the behavior of extraterrestrial engineers. It is the logic of an underworld court. Yet centuries later, these figures would be recast entirely. Modern interpretations would lift the Anunnaki from beneath the earth and place them among the stars. Their role as judges would be replaced with that of creators. Their association with fate would be transformed into genetic manipulation. The texts would be bent to fit a narrative they were never written to support. But when we remain within the Sumerian world view, the picture is clear. The Anunnaki are not the architects of humanity. They are the guardians of limits. They exist to enforce the boundaries established after the flood, when the gods withdrew and the world became less forgiving. Above them stand the great gods, and in the distant heavens, Enlil in the domain of air and authority, Enki in the depths of fresh water and wisdom. Each governs a realm essential to life. The Anunnaki govern what comes after life ends. This division of responsibility reveals a sophisticated understanding of existence. Creation, maintenance, and judgment are not performed by the same forces. The Sumerians separated these functions, assigning them to different layers of reality. Order was not centralized. It was distributed, and in this distribution, humanity occupied a narrow space, created to work, allowed to flourish, limited by mortality, bound by fate. The flood had ensured that this balance would not be forgotten. From this point forward, civilization would grow under constraint. Cities would rise knowing they could fall. Kings would rule knowing their reigns would end. Humans would labor knowing their fate was already written. The Anunnaki did not watch from the sky. They waited below. As cities rebuilt themselves after the flood, the Sumerians understood that survival alone was not enough. Order had to be maintained, not only in stone and soil, but in meaning. The world no longer rested on divine proximity. It depended on structure, and structure, in their understanding, came from something deeper than kings or armies. It came from law, written into the fabric of reality. The Sumerians called this hidden framework the me. These were not laws in the modern sense, nor commandments spoken from the sky. The me were principles, powers, and practices that defined civilization itself. Kingship was a me. Priesthood was a me. Truth, justice, music, craftsmanship, sexuality, warfare, mourning, deception, wisdom, and even descent into the underworld all belong to this sacred set. Without them, the world would not merely be chaotic, it would be unfinished. These powers did not originate with humanity. They were not invented, they were granted. According to the myths, the me were held by Enki, the god of wisdom and deep waters, stored within his domain beneath the earth. He was their custodian, not their creator. Civilization in this view was something borrowed from the divine realm, not something humans owned outright. To misuse it was to invite collapse. The transfer of the Emi is one of the most revealing moments in Sumerian mythology. Inanna, the goddess of love, power, and ambition, travels to Enki's sacred city. She does not take the me by force. She receives them through negotiation, hospitality, and intoxication. When Enki realizes what has happened, he tries desperately to undo it. But it is too late. Once released into the world, the me cannot be returned to secrecy. This story is not about theft. It is about transition. Civilization was no longer anchored solely in the deep ancient centers like Eridu. It moved outward. It spread. It became unstable, creative, dangerous. Uruk rises. Power shifts. The divine order adapts. But even as culture advances, limits remain. The me do not grant immortality. They do not erase fate. They allow humanity to function within boundaries already set. Boundaries enforced not by Enki or Inanna, but by the Anunnaki. Every innovation, every institution, every achievement still unfolds under the shadow of judgment. This is where modern misunderstandings often begin. Later readers look at the complexity of Sumerian civilization and assume advanced external intervention. How else, they ask, could writing, law, architecture, and astronomy appear so early? But the Sumerian texts themselves give a different answer. These were not technological miracles dropped from the sky. They were divine permissions released gradually, imperfectly, and always at a cost. Writing, for example, was not portrayed as enlightenment. It was responsibility. To record was to bind. To name was to fix. Once something was written, it could not be undone. Clay remembers. This is why scribes were feared as much as they were respected. They did not merely record reality, they stabilized it. In a world where fate was already written by the Anunnaki, human writing echoed divine authority in miniature. Yet even the me could not protect humanity from itself. As cities grew wealthier, rivalries intensified. Kings claimed divine favor, temples accumulated surplus, war became ritualized. The same gifts that allowed civilization to flourish also ensured conflict. This duality was not seen as a flaw, it was seen as balance. Creation and destruction were never separate in Sumerian thought, and beneath it all, unchanged and unmoved, the Anunnaki remained. They did not intervene in politics. They did not guide invention. They waited. Because no matter how advanced a city became, no matter how sacred its walls or how powerful its king, every life still ended in the same place. The underworld did not care about progress. In the Sumerian worldview, this was not pessimism. It was clarity. Civilization existed not to escape fate, but to give meaning before meeting it. As civilization expanded, the Sumerians became increasingly aware of a truth that haunted their myths. Progress did not bring humans closer to the gods. It pushed them further away. The more structured the world became, the more distant the divine presence felt. Temples grew taller, rituals more elaborate, yet the age when gods walked openly among humans was gone. This separation was not framed as punishment, it was framed as necessity. The post-flood world required distance. Direct divine involvement had proven unstable. Too much closeness led to chaos, rebellion, and destruction. What replaced it was mediation. Humans would no longer speak to gods face to face. They would approach them through priests, symbols, and carefully prescribed rituals. Temples became the bridges. A Sumerian temple was not merely a place of worship. It was a living system. It fed the gods through offerings, clothed them through textile production, and honored them through constant labor. The divine statues housed within were not representations. They were considered the gods themselves, physically present, requiring care like living beings. Every action within the temple followed precise rules. Mistakes were dangerous. Ritual error could invite drought, disease, or defeat. In a world governed by fate, correct performance mattered more than belief. This reveals something essential about Sumerian spirituality. Faith was not internal, it was enacted. To live properly was to act properly, yet even perfect ritual could not alter destiny. The gods determined the structure of the world, but fate governed individual lives. And fate, once fixed, could not be reversed. The Anunnaki stood behind this principle, silent guarantors of inevitability. They did not need temples or praise. Their authority did not depend on human participation. Humans sense this imbalance. Their texts reflect anxiety. Laments appear, songs of loss, poems mourning fallen cities, abandoned temples, broken walls. When disaster struck, it was not always explained as moral failure. Often, it was simply destiny unfolding. One of the most haunting features of Sumerian thought is the absence of justice after death. The underworld did not reward the righteous or punish the wicked. Kings and beggars shared the same fate. The dead lived on as shadows, sustained only by offerings from the living. A forgotten ancestor suffered more than a cruel ruler with descendants who remembered him. This belief reshaped how the living behaved. Legacy mattered more than virtue. Family continuity mattered more than personal righteousness. To be remembered was to exist, and so the fear was not hell, it was oblivion. Against this backdrop, myths served a different purpose than modern readers expect. They were not stories of salvation. They were explanations of limitation. They told people why suffering existed, why death was unavoidable, why the gods could not simply fix everything. In this worldview, the gods were powerful but constrained. They governed within a system older than themselves. Even Enlil and Enki answered to fate. Even they could not undo what the Anunnaki decreed. This is why rebellion against the gods is rare in Sumerian myth. Resistance is futile. Cleverness may delay consequences, as Enki often demonstrates, but it cannot erase them. Humanity's role, then, was not to overcome the divine order. It was to endure within it. Work, ritual, memory, and continuity became acts of defiance against nothingness. Building a city was a way of saying that even if everything ends, something can stand for a time, and that, to the Sumerians, was enough. They did not seek eternity in heaven. They sought permanence in clay. As centuries passed and Sumerian thought flowed into Akkadian, Babylonian, and later traditions, the old stories did not disappear. They were reshaped, names changed, emphases shifted, but the underlying structure remained. The ancient framework of fate, judgment, and distance between gods and humans endured, even as new cultures inherited it. This is where confusion begins for modern readers. When later texts speak of divine councils, of gods debating the fate of humanity, echoes of the Anunnaki can still be heard. But they are no longer always named. Their presence becomes abstracted. Authority consolidates. The many voices begin to sound like one. In Babylonian tradition, this shift is especially clear. Creation is no longer described as gradual organization, overseen by multiple generations of gods. It becomes a dramatic act of conquest. Order is established through violence. Marduk rises, defeats Tiamat, and reshapes her body into heaven and earth. Power centralizes. A single divine king replaces a complex balance. Yet even here, the old pattern survives beneath the surface. Marduk receives the tablets of destiny. He does not invent law. He is granted control over it. Fate still exists independently of the god who enforces it. Authority remains something that can be transferred, stolen, or lost. The concept did not disappear. It was simplified. This theological compression would continue. As Mesopotamian ideas traveled westward, they encountered new cultural environments. Hebrew tradition absorbed and transformed many of these elements. Flood stories, creation sequences, divine assemblies, even linguistic traces lingered. But the framework changed again. Plurality became unity. Where Sumerian texts spoke openly of many gods with divided responsibilities, later traditions folded those roles into a single divine will. Debate disappeared. Judgment became moral. Fate turned into covenant. Yet traces remain. Phrases like, "Let us make man," preserve the ghost of an older council. The idea of heavenly courts and divine witnesses echoes the Anunnaki's judicial role. Even the concept of books in which destinies are written mirrors the Sumerian belief that fate is fixed before life unfolds. What changed was not the structure, it was the interpretation. In the Sumerian world, the gods did not care about human morality in the way later religions would demand. Humans were judged by usefulness, not righteousness. Noise, not sin, brought destruction. Survival depended on favor, not virtue. Later traditions could not accept this. A god who destroys the world because it is loud is unsettling. A god who judges based on obedience and ethics is easier to understand, easier to worship, easier to fear in controlled ways. So the stories were refined, sharpened, moralized. In this process, the Anunnaki became inconvenient. They represented a world where judgment existed without moral clarity, where fate was fixed without explanation, where death was universal and unavoidable. Such ideas did not support emerging systems of religious authority that relied on promise, reward, and punishment, and so the Anunnaki faded, not erased, but absorbed, their functions redistributed, their names forgotten by most, while their role survived under new language. What modern theories do is reverse this process incorrectly. Instead of recognizing the Anunnaki as judicial figures bound to the underworld, they elevate them into creators, engineers, and visitors from the sky. This feels exciting, but it ignores the historical flow of ideas. It strips the myths of their internal logic. The truth is quieter and far more revealing. The Anunnaki were never meant to explain technology or human origins. They explained limits. They explained why power ends, why kings die, why cities fall, why even gods obey something deeper than themselves. They are not relics of forgotten science. They are mirrors of human anxiety about inevitability, and that is why their shadow persists, even when their names do not. When we strip away modern projections and return to the clay itself, a different picture comes into focus. Not one of hidden technology or lost super-civilizations, but of continuity. The Sumerian world was not an isolated anomaly. It was a foundation. Layer by layer, its ideas were inherited, reshaped, and carried forward into the cultures that followed. The Anunnaki did not vanish. They dissolved into structure. Their role as judges of fate reappears in later traditions as divine courts, heavenly councils, books of destiny, and unseen arbiters who determine the course of lives. What changes is language, not function. The fear of judgment without appeal remains constant. This continuity becomes clearest when we look at how humans understood authority. In Sumer, kings ruled because kingship descended from heaven. In later cultures, rulers ruled by divine right. The source of legitimacy remains external. Power is never purely human. It must be justified by something beyond reach. Even law follows this pattern. The earliest legal systems in Mesopotamia were not presented as human inventions. They were gifts from the gods. Justice was not negotiated. It was revealed. The famous law codes that appear later in Babylonian and Hebrew traditions carry the same assumption. Law comes from above, fixed and unquestionable. This mirrors the Anunnaki's domain. Fate is written, judgment is passed, appeal is impossible. What changes over time is how humans cope with this reality. Sumerian texts are honest about the silence of the gods. Prayers do not always work. Rituals fail. Cities fall despite devotion. The gods are present, but not predictable. This creates a religious culture focused on appeasement rather than trust. Later traditions could not accept this uncertainty. They needed meaning, purpose, assurance. So judgment became moralized. Fate became conditional. Obedience promised protection. Disobedience explained disaster. The universe became legible in ethical terms. But beneath this moral framework, the older structure remains. The idea that destiny exists before birth. That suffering is not always deserved. That death levels all distinctions. These are not inventions of later theology. They are inheritances from the oldest myths. And this is where the Anunnaki remain relevant. They remind us that human beings have always sensed limits beyond their control. That no matter how advanced civilization becomes, there is a boundary it cannot cross. A line beyond which explanation fails. In Sumerian thought, that boundary was not hidden, it was named. Modern interpretations often seek empowerment in ancient texts, proof that humanity was guided, that progress was gifted, that we are special. But the Sumerian message is more sobering. Humanity was created to work, to maintain order, to serve a system larger than itself. Meaning came from participation, not dominance. This does not diminish human dignity, it reframes it. Dignity lay in endurance, in memory, in continuity, in building knowing destruction would come, in loving knowing loss was inevitable. The Anunnaki stand at the edge of this understanding. They are not enemies, they are not saviors. They are witnesses to the fact that existence has weight, and weight, once felt, cannot be unlearned. What the clay tablets offer is not revelation in the modern sense. They offer perspective. They show us how the first civilization wrestled with the same questions we still ask. Why do we suffer? Why do we die? Why does power fail? The answers are not comforting, but they are honest, and honesty, more than myth, is what survives time. When we reach the end of this long path through clay and memory, one truth becomes impossible to avoid. The Sumerians were not trying to explain the universe as a machine. They were trying to understand their place within something that could not be controlled. What they left behind was not a secret meant to be decoded, but a worldview meant to be endured. The Anunnaki were never meant to inspire awe through power or technology. They inspired unease. They represented the final boundary, the point where questions stopped and acceptance began. In a world without promises of salvation, without moral guarantees after death, the Anunnaki embodied the certainty that life ends and judgment follows, even if that judgment is silent and impersonal. This is why they do not act like heroes or villains. They do not intervene to save cities. They do not teach humanity how to escape fate. They do not reward belief. They simply are. And that is precisely why later traditions struggled with them. As religions evolved, people demanded more from the divine. They needed justice to be fair, death to have meaning, suffering to be justified. The ancient Sumerian answer, that existence itself is the explanation, was no longer enough. So the old figures were transformed. Judges became angels, fate became covenant, silence became command, the many became one. The underworld receded, replaced by heavens and hells shaped around moral certainty. The discomfort of inevitability was softened into the language of reward and punishment. But the clay remembers, beneath every later system lies the older structure. The belief that order precedes humanity, that power comes from beyond, that life is temporary no matter how great the city or king. That memory is the only form of immortality most will ever know. This is why the Sumerians wrote. They pressed their fears, hopes, and questions into wet earth, knowing it would outlast them. Clay does not promise meaning. It preserves it. Even broken, it speaks. What came before the Anunnaki narrative was not a hidden civilization or visitors from the stars. It was a people confronting reality without illusion. A civilization willing to admit that the gods were distant, that fate was fixed, and that humanity's task was not to escape the system, but to live well within it. And perhaps that is why these stories still unsettle us. They do not flatter humanity. They do not place us at the center of the cosmos. They do not promise rescue. They remind us that we are small, temporary, and bound by forces we did not choose. Yet they also show us something quietly profound. Even knowing all of this, the Sumerians built cities. They wrote poetry. They sang hymns. They loved, mourned, and remembered. They chose to create meaning even when eternity was denied. That choice is the real inheritance, not the Anunnaki themselves, but what humanity became while living under their shadow. The clay tablets do not ask us to believe. They ask us to remember.